They came from a country where to own the land of their birth and the food it produced was denied them. A nation devastated by centuries of oppression, leaving only one export, its sons and daughters.
They came from a country.
They arrived in America with little more than their strength and determination. They were described as the scattered debris of the Irish nation. Yet upon that debris, sweat and sacrifice, a new nation was built and a new identity. They said the Irish could never be loyal Americans, yet 257 recipients of the Medal of Honor list Ireland as their birthplace. They went from being marginalized to becoming voices of advocacy. They have gone from "no Irish need apply" to contributing in every field of endeavor. They are visionaries who transform the American dream into reality, blazing a path for others to follow. They are Irish Americans, and their story is our story. March is Irish American Heritage Month.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Taylor, National Historian for the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And on behalf of our National President, Danny O'Connell, and our entire National Board, I'm pleased to welcome you to what is the first of this year's series of Irish history webinars that we put on during Irish American Heritage Month. We are now in the last year of what has been called the Decade of Centenaries, a look back at the turbulent and transformative period between 1912 and 1923 that shaped 20th century Ireland. And of course, the watershed event in that 10-year period was the Easter Rising of 1916. Most of the attention given to the rising, both then and now, has been, with notable exception, on the men who planned the rising, the men who signed the proclamation, the men who commanded the Irish forces and manned the barricades, and the men who were executed in the aftermath of the rising. Last month, the people living in Ireland enjoyed their first St. Bridget's Day, a new bank holiday honoring St. Bridget of Kildare, who has been aptly described as a peerless exemplar of Celtic feminine energy and power of achievement. Yesterday was International Women's Day, and we are in March, which is Women's History Month. And so tonight, with perhaps a good sense of timing, we are pleased to present the somewhat neglected story of the women of 1916. And we are fortunate to have with us tonight to tell that story, Dr. Michael Hogan. Dr. Hogan is a prolific author, poet, and historian, and the author in 1921 of Women of the Irish Rising, A People's History. Dr. Hogan was born in Rhode Island. He's the author of 18 books, including a collection of short stories, 6 books of poetry, collected essays on teaching in Latin America, a novel, a history of the Irish battalion in Mexico, which actually formed the basis of a movie starring Tom Berenger, and other works. He is a resident of Mexico, does significant work with the Irish embassy there, and has been involved in a variety of academic and teaching pursuits over the years. Dr. Hogan's book, interestingly enough, begins with a quote from Padraig Pearse, which I think is a good way to start our webinar tonight. And Pearse said that when the history of this fight is written, the foremost page in the annals should be given to the women of Dublin who had taken their place in the fight for the establishment of the Republic. And with that, I give you Dr. Michael Hogan.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's very special for me to present this evening to the Hibernians and to introduce you to the women of the Irish Rising, A People's History. This is a book that was recently published in Mexico. And although there are many Irish connections with the US and Canada and Mexico, and over 35 million people on the North American continent claim Irish descent, many of them, especially our young people, know very little about Ireland's history. And while there are a few books which deal with the women, including Margaret Ward's wonderful biographies and Sinead McCool's No Ordinary Women, there's a dearth of books that are both affordable and accessible to students. And as a teacher, this always gave me concern. Most of the books that I've seen are written for an academic audience, And the cheapest one, McCool's book, cost $40. And that's more than most of my students can afford. So this book fills that niche. My second goal was to integrate the lives and the stories of these women with the day-to-day activities of the Rising itself, and to make it an exciting narrative, which would appeal to younger readers as well as the more sophisticated history majors and adults. So settle back this evening and I'll share with you some of the stories I discovered over the past 2 years, researching in the Irish military archives and reading women's journals and eyewitness testimonies from the early 20th century. And 1916 was a famous year. It was, as Charles Dickens would say, the best of times and the worst of times for the Irish. The liberal British government had finally, after 300 years of tyranny, considered offering home rule to Ireland, making it, like Canada, a self-governing part of the British Commonwealth instead of an exploited colonial possession. The problem was that many English settlers in the northern part of the country refused to accept that, as did many of the conservative sympathizers in Parliament. So when British officers stationed in the north threatened mutiny, and civilians imported thousands of rifles and millions of rounds of ammunition, the Home Rule Bill was in jeopardy. Meanwhile, World War I, the war to make the world safe for democracy, had begun, and British needed Irish soldiers who were enlisting. So freedom for the Irish people would have to wait. But the leaders of the Irish Republican movement knew that once withdrawn, the offer for home rule would likely not come again. So they decided to act anyway. The problem was they had no weapons to confront the British Army's machine guns and cannons, never mind the Mauser rifles of the Ulster Volunteers in the north. Fortunately, a woman appeared who would solve this problem. Her name was Molly Childers. And in the next slide, we can see her. Molly grew up in Beacon Hill in Boston. Her family came over on the Mayflower, and they were wealthy. But as a young girl, she suffered a skating accident and was permanently crippled. After months in bed, she was finally able to walk again, but with a limp. No longer able to play sports, her father interested her in sailing, and she became adept at it. One day, when she was at home, a British officer on leave was touring New England, and he came by her house. His motorcycle had broken down, and he needed a spanner, or as we Americans say, a wrench. And he introduced himself, and the family invited him in for dinner. And he too had a limp. His came as a result of a wound from his service in the Boer War. And he too loved sailing. So he and Molly hit it off. He was very sympathetic to the Irish since he served with them in South Africa, and also saw how they were being abused and held in contempt by British commanders. Molly, for her part, had seen the prejudice and abuse of Irish workers in Boston. And when they both heard of the problems in Ireland, they were very sympathetic. To make a long story short, they fell in love, they got married, and Molly's father blessed them by giving them a 51-foot sailing yacht named the Asgard as a wedding present. When they returned to Europe and discovered the dilemma of the Irish nationalists, no weapons, they raised thousands of pounds and approached a Belgian intermediary to purchase rifles from Germany. Pretending the weapons were from Mexican insurgents who were now in their own war, the famous Mexican Revolution, they purchased 900 rifles and 29,000 rounds of ammunition, loaded them aboard their yacht, and headed for Ireland. The crew consisted of Molly, her best friend, we see in the picture as well, Mary Rice, a deckhand, and her husband, Erskine Childers, who was a novelist, by the way. Molly was the captain. Now, the problem, of course, was that even on a 51-foot yacht, there's not that much room below for that many crates of rifles and ammunition. So some had to remain on deck. And before long, they encountered a British destroyer fleet. Hurriedly, she had the men cover the ammunition crates with cushions and folded sailcloth and turned over the helm to her husband, while she and her friend perched on top in their bathing suits, distracting the sailors manning the deck guns who passed by above them. If they were stopped, it could have been the death penalty, or at the very least, a lengthy prison term for treason and committing to an armed insurrection. So here's one of the first women without whom there would be no Irish Rising. Excuse me. The fighting began on Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916, when the first group took over the General Post Office as headquarters, and another 1,500 or so took up armed positions in and around central Dublin and blockaded the streets. Now, it might be supposed that the rest of the 300 women involved played subsidiary roles, carrying messages or working as nurses or cooks. Well, some did these things, but others were armed combatants as well. A memorable one was Margaret Schneider, who we'll see in the next slide. Born in a Glasgow ghetto to Irish parents, she immigrated to Ireland, and she was sympathetic to the Irish workers who were her neighbors. She got a college degree, worked as a mathematics teacher, and she joined a women's defense league to defend Scotland against Germany in World War I. She learned how to handle explosives and how to shoot. And when she heard of the troubles in Ireland, she felt her loyalties lay there and immigrated. In Dublin, she joined the Irish Citizens Army and used her sharpshooting skills against British soldiers. She also used her munitions training to set explosives to destroy British machine guns. On one such mission, she was shot 3 times and survived. Among the many women who worked as combat medics, there was also one certified doctor, trained in England with an internship in the United States. Dr. Kathleen Lynn, on the next slide, not only provided her medical services, but trained many of the combat nurses. After the revolution, she would become the first woman to open up her own hospital for the treatment of poor children in Ireland. And she would lead Europe in establishing the first program of smallpox vaccinations. Now, it might be supposed that, like the communist revolution that was taking place in the same decade, that this was a workers' revolution, since they were the most oppressed and most revolutions were from the lower classes, or that most were Catholic because this was a Catholic country. But in fact, there were women of all classes, Catholics and Protestants, and many socialist, anti-clerical agnostics who joined together to fight for Irish independence. One from the upper classes was Constance Markovich, a wealthy noblewoman and part of the ascendancy, who turned her estate into a training school for young rebels. She sold her jewels to buy weapons and worked as a deputy battalion commander wielding a Mauser machine pistol and commanding several young men. When finally captured by the British, she was sentenced to death for her part in the rising. Now, another key woman was Nellie Gifford. And we see her in the following slide. Quite beautiful, Nellie. She was the provisioner for the rebel troops, which involved raiding British storehouses, confiscating produce and meat from markets, and supplying the rebel troops with food to sustain them during the week-long combat. Her sister Grace was in love with another insurgent, Joseph Plunkett, a well-known poet. When he was captured and sentenced to death, they married in jail 2 hours before he faced the firing squad. The song Grace, which commemorates this sad event, is sung by Rod Stewart on YouTube and worth listening to when you have a chance. The rising ended in defeat for the Irish rebels. No matter how many rifles they had, they could not compete with British machine guns, artillery, and naval cannon firing from a gunboat on the Liffey River, nor the British reinforcements, which outnumbered them 6-1. Like the Russians in the most recent war in the Ukraine, the British destroyed most of downtown Dublin, including buildings that were famously constructed as models for the British Republic, for the British Empire. Much of downtown Dublin was completely destroyed. Many people were killed, including hundreds of civilians. Over 3,000 men were captured, and many were executed by firing squad. Over 70 women were imprisoned, and one, as I mentioned, was actually sentenced to death. Now, as the executions continued day after day, from May 3rd to August 3rd, public opinion began to turn against Great Britain. The reprisals seemed barbaric and seemed motivated more by prejudice and hate than justice. Giving in finally to popular public opinion, Countess Markovich's death sentence was commuted to imprisonment by the Army Command. But the damage to Britain's reputation abroad was considerable. Besides the execution of 3 innocents early in the conflict, including a well-known pacifist, the death by firing squad of James Connolly, a beloved leader, was especially horrendous. Dying of 2 gunshot wounds, which became gangrenous, he was nevertheless tied to a chair and placed before a firing squad and shot to death in the Kilmainham jail. Even the British soldiers in the firing squad were repulsed. His daughter, Nora Connolly, who we see here in this photo, would escape. And she traveled to Boston under a forged passport. And while in Boston, she regaled the Irish American crowds with the bloody details of the British reprisals. And she was able to raise over $100,000 to support the Sinn Féin independence movement, which would continue, of course, this time as a guerrilla war. The British, their reputation already suffering as news of the concentration camps in South Africa became common knowledge, and concerned with new labor protest movements at home, ultimately would relent and give in to world opinion. The Irish would yet see their independence become a reality despite their defeat in combat. For the women who had sacrificed so much, the freedom that they had envisioned would not come as easily. It was not until 1948 that their combat records were included in the military archives, when an alert officer noted that many of the veterans of the Rising were dying off. They were invited to Army headquarters to record their oral histories. And it is from these records that I derived many of the narratives that appear in the book. Some of them went on to accomplish a great deal after the Rising was put down. After serving their prison sentences, many went on to have brilliant careers. Dr. Kathleen Lynn opened her famous hospital, as I mentioned, and became a major force for curing contagious diseases, especially among children. Constance Markovich was elected first to the British Parliament, and then after the Republic was established, became an Irish senator. When she was elected to the British Parliament, by the way, she refused to take her seat. But then after the Republic was established, she became an Irish senator. Margaret Schneider became a popular mathematics teacher in Dublin and was elected president of the Teachers Union. Nellie Gifford became a broadcast journalist and the unofficial historian of the Easter Rising. Most were disheartened, however, when the new Irish Constitution was promulgated by reactionaries. It was heavily influenced by a conservative bishop, John McQuaid, and a former teacher of De Valera, who was then his neighbor. It forbade not only abortion, but birth control. It denied women the right to serve on juries or in administrative positions. It forbade divorce. There would have to be another fight to secure these rights and to establish themselves on equal footing with men. Unable to buck the conservative legislatures, they took to the streets and voted en masse for referendums, which overturned the restrictive provisions of the Constitution and secured those rights. Today, Ireland leads the world with women in administrative and government positions. It is the only country which has had back-to-back women presidents. It has had more women CEOs than any other European nation. But more importantly, it leads the world in intersectional feminism, working not just to ensure opportunities for middle-class women, but for all women, regardless of social or economic status, including newly arrived immigrants from war-torn nations. And now we return to the present. And I'd like to close with a few words of how I came to write this book. Many years ago, my daughter Melissa was attacked by an aggressive pit bull. She was 5 years old and living in Boulder, Colorado, an upscale and very safe neighborhood. Her mother was cooking dinner and keeping watch out the window while Melissa was playing in the backyard. Suddenly, a pit bull on the loose jumped the fence and attacked her. Before her mom could come to the rescue, the dog had savagely torn up the child's face. Throughout her youth and adolescence, Melissa would go through 30 painful facial surgeries. She would be mocked by other kids for her deformity. She would suffer both physically and psychologically. But she came through all those years with her pride, her courage, her sense of herself intact. She went to the University of Colorado. She spent her junior year abroad in Ireland, studying first at Trinity University, and then working with both Catholic and Protestant women during the bloody conflict between the British-dominated North and the independent and largely Catholic South. She graduated with honors, and her honors thesis was on the possibility of peace in the region if only women from both sides could come together. She put together a proposal for action and worked as a volunteer organizing reunions between mothers and wives on both sides. In 1998, she was hired by former President Bill Clinton to work with him on the Irish Peace Treaty, and was with him when both the Ulster Unionist Party in the North and the Labour Party and Sinn Féin in the South signed the Good Friday Agreement, bringing peace to the region. So this book is a tribute to her as well, and to all the women who have suffered and triumphed, who have come through pain and even horror, to not only make something of themselves, but to serve the larger community. My thanks to all of you and the Hibernians for attending this evening. I hope you'll read the book. I think you'll enjoy it. And if you hang around, I'd be glad to answer any questions you have or listen to any comments you might wish to make. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hogan. And I want to just go back to the very first woman that you talked about, Molly Childers. When you hear that story, this is an American woman, basically a Boston Brahmin debutante who's running guns for the Irish people with a yacht that she received as a wedding gift. Mm-hmm. How unlikely a story is that?
Actually, I've been approached by a fellow that wants to, he's written a screenplay and wants to make a movie out of that story. So I have all her diaries, which she describes, the scene when she's going through the destroyer fleet is just spine chilling. Actually, when I was reading her journal, my palms were wet. Oh my God, the risk she ran.
It's really something. And when you think about Irish culture before the Norman invasion, before the Tudors, we look back at the Brehon laws. Women in native Irish culture had a much larger and more advanced role, you might say, than they did for years under English and British occupation. Can you draw any connection between that sort of native Irish tradition of strong women and the role that these women played in the Rising?
Well, yeah, one of the interesting things that happened, I think, and the great tragedy is there's a whole stream of women activists, not only from the pre-invasion time that you talk about, but right up until the labor strikes in 1914. Women were very, very active, and Connolly, who of course was in charge of that, had a great deal of respect for women. And it was Connolly ultimately who gave the go-ahead to have these women take part in the Rising. The person who did not go along with it was Eamon de Valera. Everybody else was pretty much, was pretty much in favor of it. The problem was in 1916, when the British captured, all the leaders, they put them to death, with the exception of de Valera. So the one conservative in the group, the one who did not trust women to pick up a rifle, was the one who ultimately, became the head of the country and the one who was most active in forming the Constitution. So it was kind of a betrayal of the original, movement, which was very inclusive. As a matter of fact, the Irish Constitution, the Irish Proclamation, rather, of 1916, which Patrick Pierce wrote, says Irish men and women. He includes them in the proclamation. But De Valera would have none of it.
And you mentioned that some of the many women who were involved played the more traditional role that you would expect of someone, in that era, cooking and nursing and so forth. But there were women who served as snipers and actually took up arms as part of the Rising. That was sort of out of character for what the gender role that would have been assigned to them back at the time. Exactly,
but that's what Connolly, saw was valuable, was worthwhile, and Margaret Schneider, a remarkable woman. She was not only shot 3 times, but after she was shot, they had no antibiotics. Then they had a caustic kind of substance that they poured on the wound to kind of burn the microbes away. So she suffered horribly from her wounds. Constance Markovich, of course, used her entire fortune to arm and train young men. She was also the Irish Boy Scout leader, and so she's marching these young boys, 15, 16, 17 years old, and training them in the use of weapons. Ultimately, hoping that they would be able to take part actively in the Rising, which they did. She started that back in 1914.
And of course, she's the one woman that most popular histories of the Rising will talk about. Yeah. Kind of hard to miss her, being as she was somewhat flamboyant, and as I recall, was actually sentenced to death and then got a reprieve.
Exactly. And she stood out. She was a big woman. She was like 6 foot tall. So that was rare in those days as well.
And if you look at contemporary newspaper accounts of the Rising, there's scarcely any mention at all of the women that took part. And I imagine part of that does reflect society at the time did not expect women to take part in such activities. And it was sort of just ignored, I think.
Well, it reflects the difference between conservatives and liberals in the Irish in the Irish and British governments. As I say, Connolly and the fellows with him, who were all put to death, were all pretty much at ease with the women and supported them and promoted them and gave them not only weapons, but gave them positions of leadership. But De Valera and the crew that followed, were not of that ilk. They were of the more conservative, group, as were the British, of course. But the British at this time, remember, they were going through a major attempt by women to get the vote. The women's suffrage movement in England was a big deal in the early 1900s. And they were putting women in jail. They were putting them in cells, in isolation cells, when they marched to get the vote. And of course, you mentioned women's suffrage. 1918, 2 years after the Rising, the Irish election, the first to have women with the vote, and it resulted in the remarkable landslide for Sinn Féin. Yeah, and they refused to take their seats. The abstention policy. And of course, today, as you mentioned, we see quite a few women in leadership in Ireland, and particularly in Sinn Féin, where the national leader and the leader in the 6 counties are women at this time. Exactly. Yeah, Sinn Féin has been very supportive of the book as well. They've gone out of their way to support the podcast we've done over there. We've done podcasts at the Cavan Library. We've done podcasts in several different places in Ireland. Which is very good. And also the Mexican embassy has been really good here in supporting the efforts. St. Bridget's Day, we did a big promotion. Now, the book, Dr. Hogan, is Women of the Irish Rising, A People's History, and that's available right now on Amazon. Is that right? Right, correct. All right. And for our viewers who are interested in the rest of the series this month, on March 13th, Monday at 7 p.m., we're going to have
Professor Aidan Beatty, who's going to be talking about the revival of the Irish language in the 20th century. On March 25th, Saturday at 1 p.m., we're going to have Robert Collins talking about his book, The First Full-Length Treatment of Nor-Aid and Irish American involvement in the conflict in the North in the 70s and 80s. And then finally, on Wednesday, March 29th, Professor David Wilson of the University of Toronto is going to talk about the Fenian invasion of Canada, and specifically the response to that by the Canadian authorities, particularly the secret police who infiltrated the movement. So we have an interesting lineup coming up for the rest of the month, and I'm looking to see if we have any questions for Dr. Hogan today. I don't see any. So I want to thank everyone, of course, for participating tonight. And Dr. Hogan, I'll leave with you to give a final few words to take us out.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's been a pleasure presenting here tonight, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you, Danny, as well, Danny O'Connell as well, for inviting me. And thank you, Chris Cook, for your technical expertise. It's a real delight, and I'm hoping to see this book in the hands of readers. I've made it available in a price less than $20, so that it would be available for my students as well who can afford that. And it's done very well. It's also supported by the embassies of the United States and Mexico, the Irish embassies in both countries. So I'm looking forward to more readers and hoping to hear from them as well. And put your comments on Amazon after you've read it and let me know.
Professor, this is Danny O'Connell again. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Danny.
We have another Daniel O'Connell on the line who has a question. I just put him in so he could ask that question. Go ahead, Daniel.
Thanks, Dan. I apologize for my voice, Dr. Hogan. I take a lot of pride in reading my Irish history. To a newspaper, Irish Echo, you may be familiar with, 70s. I would suggest, if it hasn't already been done, because a lot of times I don't get to read all the issues, this history needs to be told. And maybe they would run an article, especially as we're coming up to St. Patrick's Day. Just a suggestion or to the Hibernians, because I know they run many articles and stories about the Hibernians. But I just want to say thanks. It was wonderful. I've taken notes here, and I'm looking forward to going to my division meeting to tell the people about these fabulous women and what they did. Like I said, I actually sent you a comment. The only one I'd ever heard of was Countess Markovitz. I never heard of any of the others. I heard of James Conley. I never knew he had a daughter. I live in New Jersey, and a good friend of mine of Irish descent told me James Conley for a while lived in Newark, New Jersey.
Yeah. Conley was in the States for quite a while.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, he was doing fundraising there. You mentioned the Irish Echo, and I'll take you up on that because I think that's a good suggestion. The Irish Times, which is also online, Irish Times, they reviewed the book, and that's a very reputable newspaper as well. So,
and they may have already done it, Dr. Hogan. It just, I may not have read it. But when you were talking about this, I just know this is a part of Irish history. It needs to be highlighted a little bit.
No, I agree. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Dan. Dan Taylor, back to you.
All right, and if that's our question for the night, again, I want to thank Dr. Hogan for being with us, and for Chris Cook for putting this together, and our national president, Danny O'Connell. And with that, we'll conclude this first webinar of the series for 2023. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.